She was left standing on a train platform in 1882, her wedding dress in tatters and half her face melted beyond recognition, while a crowd of strangers whispered "monster" behind gloved hands. The man who had promised to love her forever took one look at what the fire had done and declared her unmarriageable to any decent Christian soul. But sometimes the most broken hearts find their match in the most unexpected places, and sometimes a one-eyed Arikara warrior sees beauty where others see only scars. This is the story of how Cordelia May Sinclair learned that love doesn't live in mirrors, but in the courage to look beyond them.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Cordelia May Sinclair had been the undisputed belle of Denver's elite social circle, a raven-haired beauty whose laughter could charm the birds from trees and whose violet eyes held promises of adventures that respectable young ladies weren't supposed to dream about. At 24, she possessed that rare combination of refined education and spirited independence that made her equally comfortable discussing literature in drawing rooms or racing horses across the Colorado plains when she thought no one was watching. Her father, Colonel Harrison Sinclair, had made his fortune in silver mining before transitioning into territorial politics, and her mother, Delilah, was descended from Virginia plantation aristocracy. Together, they had built the Sinclair name into one of the most respected families west of the Mississippi, and Cordelia May was to be their crowning achievement, a daughter who would marry into Eastern establishment and prove that the Western territories could produce ladies every bit as refined as those born in Boston parlors. The Sinclair estate sprawled across 300 acres just outside Denver, with a main house that rivaled any mansion in Charleston or Savannah. Cordelia May had been raised with every advantage money could buy: French governesses, private music masters, and finishing school in St. Louis. But beneath her polished exterior beat the heart of a true frontier daughter. She could ride like a Comanche, shoot better than most men, and possessed an adventurous spirit that constantly worried her mother and secretly delighted her father. Cordelia May reached marriageable age. Suitors arrived from every corner of the country. Railroad heirs from New York, shipping magnates' sons from San Francisco, and even a European count who claimed to be charmed by the exotic appeal of American frontier aristocracy. But none had captured her restless heart until Nathaniel Blackwood arrived from his family's banking empire in Philadelphia. Nathaniel was everything Cordelia May had been raised to marry: devastatingly handsome, impeccably educated, and possessed of the kind of refined manners that spoke of generations of careful breeding. He was also sophisticated enough to appreciate Cordelia May's independent spirit without being threatened by it, or so it seemed during their year-long courtship. Their engagement had been announced with great fanfare in both Denver and Philadelphia. Society papers. Nathaniel spent months traveling between the two cities, courting Cordelia May with the kind of romantic gestures that made other young ladies sigh with envy. He brought her first edition books of poetry, commissioned portraits of her from renowned artists, and wrote letters that quoted Shakespeare and Byron with the ease of a man truly educated in the classics. The wedding was planned for June 15th, 1882, with a ceremony at Denver's most prestigious Episcopal church followed by a reception at the Post Sinclair estate that would host 500 guests from across the country. Cordelia May's wedding dress was being created by the finest seamstress in San Francisco, made from silk imported from Paris and adorned with pearls that had belonged to Nathaniel's grandmother. But as the wedding date approached, Cordelia May began to notice small things that troubled her. Nathaniel would sometimes make casual comments about taming her wild Western ways once they were settled in Philadelphia. He spoke of their future life in terms that suggested she would be expected to abandon her love of riding and outdoor pursuits in favor of the more sedentary pastimes of Eastern society ladies. Still, Cordelia May convinced herself that these were minor concerns. Nathaniel loved her, and she believed that love would be strong enough to bridge any differences in their expectations. She threw herself into wedding preparations with characteristic enthusiasm, determined to create a celebration that would be remembered for decades. The fire started in the Sinclair Estates kitchen at approximately 10 o'clock on the evening of June 10th, just 5 days before the wedding. Cordelia May had been in her rooms on the second floor, making final adjustments to her wedding veil by lamplight. When she smelled smoke. At first, she thought little of it. The kitchen staff often worked late preparing for large entertainments, and the scent of cooking fires was common in the evening hours. But as the smell grew stronger and took on the acrid quality of burning wood rather than cooking food, Cordelia May became concerned. She opened her bedroom door to find the hallway filled with thick gray smoke. The sound of crackling flames was clearly audible from somewhere below, and she could hear panicked voices shouting orders in the distance. Without hesitation, Cordelia May gathered her skirts and ran toward the servants' quarters, where she knew several of the staff lived. With their families, the fire had started when a kitchen maid accidentally knocked over a lamp while cleaning up after the evening meal. The flame had caught the wooden flour barrels, then spread quickly to the dry goods pantry, and from there to the wooden support beams of the kitchen ceiling. By the time Cordelia May reached the servants' wing, the entire back section of the house was engulfed in flames. Cordelia May found 3 of the maids trapped in their rooms by a collapsed beam that blocked the main hallway. Without thinking of her own safety, she climbed through a window onto the estate's wraparound porch and worked her way around to their windows, helping each woman climb to safety. The youngest maid, Sarah, was only 16 and was paralyzed with fear. Cordelia May had to climb back into the burning building to carry the girl out. It was during this final rescue that disaster struck. As Cordelia May was helping Sarah through the window, a section of the burning roof collapsed, sending a shower of flaming debris down upon them. Cordelia May threw herself over Sarah to protect the girl, taking the full force of the burning timber across her own back and the left side of her face. The pain was unlike anything Cordelia May had ever experienced, a searing agony that seemed to consume not just her flesh but her very soul. She remembered screaming, remembered the smell of her own burning hair and skin, and then mercifully, she remembered nothing else until she woke up in Dr. Morrison's clinic 3 days later. Dr. Morrison was Denver's most skilled physician, but even his considerable expertise was limited when it came to treating severe burns. Cordelia May's injuries covered the entire left side of her face, from her temple down to her jaw, and extended across her left shoulder and upper back. The burns were deep, destroying not just the surface skin, but the underlying tissue that would determine how the wounds healed. For 2 weeks, Cordelia May drifted between consciousness and fevered delirium. Her parents maintained a constant vigil beside her bed, while Dr. Morrison fought to prevent infection and manage her pain with the limited medical resources available in 1882. The burned flesh had to be kept clean and dressed daily, a process so agonizing that Cordelia May would often lose consciousness from the pain. When she was finally strong enough to sit up and take notice of her surroundings, Cordelia May's first request was for a mirror. Dr. Morrison and her parents tried to discourage her, insisting that she focus on healing rather than appearance. But Cordelia May was not a woman who could be deflected from her purposes. What she saw in that small hand mirror destroyed the last remnants of the world she had known. The left side of her face was a landscape of angry red scar tissue, twisted and pulled in ways that had completely altered her features. Her left eye was intact, though surrounded by scarred skin that pulled at the lid. Her cheek was a mass of ridged scar tissue, and the scarring extended down her neck in patterns that looked like twisted rope. Cordelia May stared at her reflection for a long time without speaking. When she finally set the mirror down, she asked only one question. "Has Nathaniel been to see me?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The silence that followed told her everything she needed to know, that Nathaniel had indeed come to the clinic, once. He had arrived the day after the fire, when Cordelia May was still unconscious, and had spoken with Dr. Morrison about her condition. When the doctor explained the extent of her injuries and the likelihood that she would be permanently disfigured, Nathaniel had asked to see her. Dr. Morrison had pulled back the bandages covering Cordelia May's face, and Nathaniel had taken one look before stepping back with unconcealed revulsion. He had asked the doctor if there was any possibility that she would heal without scarring, and when Dr. Morrison honestly replied that such recovery was impossible, Nathaniel had made his decision. "I cannot marry a woman who looks like that," he had told Dr. Morrison with the cold calculation of a man discussing a poor business investment. "My family has certain expectations, certain standards. A disfigured wife would destroy my social standing and business prospects. Please tell Miss Sinclair that I release her from our engagement with my sincere regrets." Dr. Morrison had tried to convince Nathaniel to reconsider, to at least wait until Cordelia May was conscious so he could speak with her himself. But Nathaniel was adamant. He left Denver that same day, and by the time Cordelia May was well enough to receive visitors, he was already back in Philadelphia, informing society contacts that his engagement had been dissolved due to unforeseen circumstances. The wedding gifts were returned, the invitations canceled, and the elaborate reception preparations dismantled. Word spread quickly through Denver society that Nathaniel Blackwood had abandoned his bride-to-be because of her disfigurement, and the scandal provided months of whispered gossip for drawing rooms across the territory. Some society matrons clucked sympathetically about poor dear Cordelia May, but their sympathy was tinged with the kind of morbid fascination that people reserve for tragedies that confirm their worst fears about the fragility of beauty and fortune. Others were more cruel, suggesting that perhaps Cordelia May's wild ways had finally caught up with her, implying that the fire was somehow divine punishment for her unladylike independence. But the cruelest cut came from her own social circle. Young ladies who had once competed for her friendship now treated her with the kind of nervous politeness reserved for the pitiable. Gentlemen who had once sought her attention now could barely bring themselves to look at her directly. The life she had known, the balls, the soirees, the elaborate social rituals that had defined her existence, was simply no longer available to her. As Cordelia May's physical strength returned, her emotional devastation deepened. She found herself unable to leave the Sinclair estate, unwilling to face the stares and whispered comments that followed her everywhere in Denver society. Her parents, heartbroken by their daughter's suffering, tried everything they could think of to restore her spirits. Colonel Sinclair offered to take her to the finest doctors in New York or even Europe, hoping that someone might be able to improve her appearance through surgery. Delilah suggested that they could travel extensively, perhaps finding a place where Cordelia May's past wasn't known and she could build a new life. But Cordelia May seemed to have lost all interest in the future. For months, she spent her days reading in the library or walking alone through the estate's gardens, always wearing a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed her face and a veil that concealed her scars. She refused all social invitations and turned away the few brave friends who attempted to visit. It was as if the fire had burned away not just her physical beauty, but her very sense of who she was meant to be in the world. The turning point came when Cordelia May overheard two of the maids discussing her situation. They were genuinely sympathetic, but their conversation revealed the harsh reality of her circumstances. At 24, with her face permanently disfigured, Cordelia May was effectively unmarriageable by the standards of her social class. No respectable gentleman would take a scarred wife, and without marriage, she faced a lifetime of dependence on her parents' charity. That night, Cordelia May made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She announced to her parents that she intended to travel west to the frontier territories, where she hoped to find work as a schoolteacher or governess. It was a shocking proposition. A woman of her background and education taking employment was scandalous enough, but traveling alone to the rough frontier towns was virtually unthinkable. Colonel Sinclair forbade it absolutely. "You're not thinking clearly, my dear," he said. "The frontier is no place for a lady, especially not one in your condition. You'll stay here where you're safe and cared for." But Cordelia May had inherited her father's determination along with his silver mine fortune. "I will not spend the rest of my life hiding in this house like some shameful secret," she declared. "If I cannot have the life I was raised to expect, then I will make a different life entirely." It took weeks of arguments, tears, and negotiations, but eventually Cordelia May wore down her parents' resistance. Colonel Sinclair used his political connections to secure her a position as a schoolteacher in a small town called Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory. It was frontier work in a frontier place, but it offered something that Denver society could not: the possibility of being judged for her abilities rather than her appearance. The night before her departure, Delilah helped Cordelia May pack her few belongings, practical traveling clothes, a few treasured books, and her mother's wedding ring, which Delilah insisted she take for when the right man comes along. Cordelia May almost laughed at the optimism, but she accepted the ring to spare her mother's feelings. As the family carriage carried Cordelia May toward the train station the next morning, she felt a mixture of terror and relief. She was leaving behind everything familiar and safe, venturing into a world where she knew no one and where her disfigurement would mark her as different from the moment she arrived. But she was also leaving behind the suffocating pity and social prison that her old life had become. What Cordelia May didn't know was that her journey to Cedar Ridge would take her through the small railway junction of Bitter Creek Station, Wyoming Territory, where she would be forced to change trains for the final leg of her journey. And she certainly couldn't have imagined that at Bitter Creek Station, her carefully planned new life would collide with a past she thought she had left behind forever. The train wheezed to a stop at Bitter Creek Station with the exhausted sigh of machinery pushed beyond its limits. Cordelia May peered through the grimy window at what could generously be called a platform, little more than weathered planks laid across railroad ties, with a single wooden structure that served as both depot and telegraph office. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desolate Wyoming landscape, where sagebrush and tumbleweeds seemed to be the only permanent residents. Bitter Creek Station was supposed to be a brief stop, a place where Cordelia May would transfer from the Denver and Rio Grande line to the smaller spur that would carry her north to Cedar Ridge, Montana. According to her carefully planned itinerary, she should have had just enough time to stretch her legs, perhaps buy a cup of coffee, and board the northbound train that was scheduled to arrive 30 minutes after her current train departed. But as Cordelia May gathered her traveling bag and prepared to disembark, she noticed something that made her stomach tighten with apprehension. Standing on the platform, looking decidedly out of place among the rough frontier travelers and railroad workers, was a figure she recognized with sickening clarity: Nathaniel Blackwood, her former fiancé. Dressed in an expensive traveling coat and carrying himself with the same arrogant bearing that had once seemed so attractive, Cordelia May's first instinct was to remain in her seat, to pull her veil lower and hope that Nathaniel wouldn't notice her among the other passengers. But the conductor was already calling for all passengers to disembark, and she realized with growing dread that there was no avoiding this encounter. She had specifically chosen a route through obscure frontier stations to avoid anyone from her past. But somehow Nathaniel had found her as she stepped down from the train car, keeping her scarred face turned away from the platform. Cordelia May heard Nathaniel's voice cutting through the general noise of the station. "Cordelia May, what a surprise to encounter you in such a remote location." She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Nathaniel was smiling, but it was the cold, calculating expression she had learned to recognize during their engagement, the look he wore when he was about to say something particularly cutting under the guise of polite conversation. "Hello, Nathaniel," Cordelia May replied quietly, grateful that her veil concealed most of her expression. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm traveling to San Francisco on business," Nathaniel explained, his eyes scanning her appearance with obvious distaste. "Mining investments, you understand. Though I must say, I'm shocked to find you traveling alone to such primitive locations. Surely your parents haven't approved of this reckless adventure?" Before Cordelia May could respond, Nathaniel continued with the kind of false concern that fooled no one. "I heard through mutual acquaintances that you had recovered from your unfortunate accident. Though I must say, the reports of your condition appear to have been quite accurate." The casual cruelty of his words hit Cordelia May like a physical blow. Nathaniel was looking directly at her veil, making it clear that he could see enough of her scarred face to confirm his worst assumptions about her appearance. But worse than his cruelty was the way he was speaking loudly enough for other passengers to hear, drawing attention to her disfigurement with deliberate malice. "I'm quite well, thank you," Cordelia May managed to say, though her voice sounded strained even to her own ears. "I'm traveling to Montana Territory to begin a new position." Nathaniel's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. "Employment? How modern of you. Though I suppose given your current circumstances, traditional expectations of feminine domesticity are no longer applicable." The insult was delivered with such practiced smoothness that anyone overhearing might have mistaken it for genuine sympathy. But Cordelia May understood exactly what Nathaniel was saying, that her disfigurement had rendered her unmarriageable, and therefore forced her into the kind of paid employment that respectable ladies avoided. "Indeed," Cordelia May replied with as much dignity as she could muster. "I've discovered that adversity can reveal opportunities that comfortable circumstances often obscure." For a moment, Nathaniel's polished mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine anger. Cordelia May realized that her composed response had frustrated him. He had been expecting her to crumble under his verbal assault, to provide him with the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken by his rejection. "How philosophical," Nathaniel said, recovering his false sympathy. "Though I do hope you understand that your decision to venture into frontier society reflects a certain acceptance of diminished expectations. The territories can be quite forgiving of those who have fallen from more elevated circumstances." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the northbound train, and Cordelia May felt a surge of relief. Whatever game Nathaniel was playing, it would end when she boarded the train to Cedar Ridge and left him behind at Bitter Creek Station. But as the locomotive approached, something seemed wrong. The train was moving too fast, and instead of slowing for a station stop, it raced past the platform with a thunderous roar that left everyone standing in clouds of dust and coal smoke. Cordelia May watched in growing alarm as her connection to Montana Territory disappeared into the distance without so much as reducing speed. The station master, a grizzled man in overalls and a conductor's cap, emerged from the depot shaking his head. "Northbound's running 6 hours late out of Cheyenne," he announced to the confused passengers. "Telegraph says there was a washout near Laramie that's got the whole schedule fouled up. Next train north won't be through until tomorrow morning." Cordelia May felt the blood drain from her face. She was stranded at Bitter Creek Station overnight, in a place that barely qualified as a town, with nowhere to stay and limited funds for unexpected expenses. Worse, she was stranded in the presence of Nathaniel, who was clearly relishing her predicament. "How unfortunate," Nathaniel said with obvious satisfaction. "I suppose this is what one must expect when traveling on frontier railways. The accommodations here are undoubtedly quite primitive." Cordelia May looked around the station with growing despair. Besides the depot, Bitter Creek Station consisted of a single general store, a saloon that looked like it catered to railroad workers and drifters, and what might charitably be called a boarding house, a two-story, wooden structure that appeared to have been constructed hastily and maintained poorly. "I'm sure I can find suitable lodging," Cordelia May said, though she was far from certain. The boarding house looked rough, and she had no idea whether it would be safe or appropriate for a woman traveling alone. Nathaniel glanced at the ramshackle buildings surrounding the station and smiled with malicious amusement. "Oh, I'm quite sure you'll find accommodations that match your current circumstances, though I fear they may be rather different from what you were accustomed to in Denver society." As Cordelia May struggled with the reality of her situation, more bad news arrived in the form of another passenger from her train, a severe-looking woman in black traveling dress who introduced herself as Mrs. Abernathy. The wife of a prominent businessman from Denver, Mrs. Abernathy had obviously been listening to Cordelia May's conversation with Nathaniel, and her expression suggested that she had drawn her own conclusions about Cordelia May's identity and circumstances. "Miss Sinclair," Mrs. Abernathy said with the kind of cold politeness that conveyed absolute disapproval, "I couldn't help but overhear your conversation. How ... Surprising to encounter you in such circumstances." Cordelia May realized with sinking heart that Mrs. Abernathy had recognized her name and was now putting together the pieces of Denver society gossip. Within hours, everyone at Bitter Creek Station would know that the scarred woman traveling alone was the disgraced former belle who had been abandoned by her fiancé. "Mrs. Abernathy," Cordelia May nodded politely, hoping to end the conversation quickly, but Mrs. Abernathy was just getting started. "I must say, your parents showed remarkable tolerance in allowing you to travel unaccompanied in your condition, though I suppose traditional expectations of propriety become somewhat flexible when circumstances are so very altered." The woman's words were chosen with surgical precision, each one designed to remind Cordelia May of her fall from social grace while maintaining a veneer of sympathetic concern. Nathaniel watched the exchange with obvious pleasure, clearly enjoying the spectacle of Cordelia May's public humiliation. "I appreciate your concern," Cordelia May replied evenly, though inside she was screaming. "If you'll excuse me, I need to secure lodging for the evening." As Cordelia May walked toward the boarding house, she could hear Mrs. Abernathy speaking in hushed but audible tones to Nathaniel. "Such a tragedy, really. She was quite lovely before the fire, you know. But, of course, after such disfigurement, well, what respectable man could be expected to?" The words followed Cordelia May across the dusty platform like invisible arrows, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. By the time she reached the boarding house, her hands were shaking, and her carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack. The boarding house proprietor was a thick-set woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who looked Cordelia May up and down with obvious suspicion. "You wanting a room?" she asked in accented English that suggested European origins. "Yes, please," Cordelia May replied. "Just for one night. The northbound train was delayed." Mrs. Kowalski quoted a price that was higher than Cordelia May had expected, but she nodded agreement and reached for her traveling funds. As she was counting out the money, she became aware that other guests were gathering in the boarding house's small lobby, drawn by curiosity about the well-dressed woman with the scarred face. "You traveling alone?" Mrs. Kowalski asked bluntly. "Yes," Cordelia May replied, then added defensively, "I'm a schoolteacher, traveling to take a position in Montana Territory." Mrs. Kowalski's expression softened slightly at this information, but the other guests continued to stare with the kind of morbid fascination that Cordelia May had learned to expect. She could hear whispered conversations speculating about her appearance, her circumstances, and her reasons for traveling alone through frontier territory. The room Mrs. Kowalski showed her was small and spartanly furnished, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the train tracks. It was clean but basic, a far cry from the luxurious accommodations Cordelia May had known throughout her privileged life. But at least it offered privacy and escape from the staring eyes and whispered comments that seemed to follow her everywhere. As evening approached, Cordelia May faced a new dilemma: finding dinner. The boarding house offered meals, but they were served in a common dining room where she would be forced to endure more stares and questions from curious guests. The alternative was the saloon, which was clearly inappropriate for a respectable woman, or going without food entirely. Cordelia May chose the dining room, steeling herself for another ordeal of public scrutiny. As she entered the cramped space, where a dozen travelers were gathered around two long tables, conversation stopped abruptly. Every eye in the room focused on her veiled face, and she could feel the weight of their curiosity. Like a physical presence, she took a seat at the end of one table and tried to eat her simple meal of beef stew and cornbread while ignoring the whispered conversations happening around her. But it was impossible to block out completely, especially when she heard her own name mentioned in hushed tones. "That's the Sinclair girl from Denver," someone was saying. "Heard she was burned in a fire and her fiancé left her at the altar." "Poor thing," came another voice. "Though you can hardly blame the man. What gentleman wants a wife who looks like that?" The cruelest comment came from a traveling salesman who spoke loudly enough for the entire room to hear. "Shame about this face, but I suppose even damaged goods have their uses. Probably why she's heading to the territories frontier men aren't so particular about appearances." The crude suggestion was met with uncomfortable laughter from some of the other diners, and Cordelia May felt her cheeks burning with humiliation beneath her veil. She stood abruptly, leaving her meal half-finished, and fled back to her room. Once alone, Cordelia May finally allowed herself to break down. She sat on the narrow bed and wept for everything she had lost: her beauty, her social position, her sense of identity, and most painfully, her naive belief that love could survive physical imperfection. The fire had taken so much more than her appearance. It had burned away her faith in human nature and her hope for happiness. But even as she grieved, Cordelia May felt a spark of the determination that had carried her through the worst moments of her recovery. She had survived the fire, survived Nathaniel's abandonment, and survived the social ostracism that followed. She would survive this night of humiliation as well. And tomorrow she would continue her journey toward whatever new life awaited her in Montana Territory. What Cordelia May didn't know was that her ordeal at Bitter Creek Station was being observed by someone who saw her situation very differently than the cruel strangers who surrounded her. Standing in the shadows outside the boarding house, a figure watched her window with eyes that understood suffering and recognized courage when they saw it. Iron Hawk had been tracking the same northbound train that Cordelia May was waiting for, but for very different reasons. He was searching for his younger brother, who had been taken by soldiers 3 months earlier and was rumored to be imprisoned at Fort Yellowstone. Iron Hawk had been following leads across 3 territories, always one step behind the army units that had destroyed his family and scattered his people. As a member of the Arikara nation, Iron Hawk knew what it meant to be seen as something less than human by the white society that had claimed dominion over his ancestral lands. He understood what it was like to be stared at with fear and disgust, to be considered a savage whose very existence was an affront to civilized sensibilities. But Iron Hawk also possessed something that most of the people in Bitter Creek Station had never developed: the ability to see past surface appearances to the character beneath. When he watched Cordelia May endure the cruel comments and malicious stares of her fellow travelers with quiet dignity, he recognized a warrior spirit that reminded him of the strongest women in his own tribe. As the night deepened and the boarding house grew quiet, Iron Hawk made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Tomorrow, when Cordelia May boarded the northbound train to continue her journey, she would not be traveling alone. And perhaps, in the vast wilderness of Montana Territory, two wounded souls might find the healing that civilized society had denied them both. Dawn broke over Bitter Creek Station with the pale, unforgiving light that only the high plains could produce, harsh and revealing, leaving no shadows to hide in and no mercy for those who preferred darkness. Cordelia May had barely slept, spending most of the night sitting by her window watching the empty railroad tracks stretch into infinity, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in leaving the safety of her parents' home for this unforgiving frontier world. The boarding house had come alive before sunrise with the sounds of travelers preparing for departure, the creaking of floorboards and muffled conversations in languages she couldn't identify. Heavy boots stomped through hallways as men prepared for another day of hard travel across territories that promised little comfort and less mercy. Cordelia May dressed carefully in her traveling clothes, adjusting her veil to ensure maximum coverage of her scarred face, and prepared herself for another day of enduring the stares and whispers of strangers. As she gathered her few belongings, Cordelia May could hear voices from the room next to hers, rough male voices discussing something in hushed but urgent tones. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone made her skin crawl with an indefinable sense of danger. One voice sounded familiar, and with growing alarm, she realized it belonged to the traveling salesman who had made the crude comments about her the previous evening. When she descended to the dining room for breakfast, she found the same collection of travelers who had tormented her the previous evening, plus several new faces, rough-looking men in work clothes who eyed her with the kind of calculating interest that made her wish she could disappear entirely. The traveling salesman, whose name she had learned was Silas Markham, nodded at her with a leering smile that suggested he was prepared to continue his harassment with renewed enthusiasm. Well, Markham said loudly enough for the entire room to hear. If it isn't our lovely traveling companion. Sleep well, did you? I imagine it gets lonely in these frontier accommodations, especially for a lady traveling without protection. The emphasis he placed on the last word made Cordelia May's stomach turn. She took a seat at the far end of one of the dining tables, hoping to discourage conversation, but Markham rose from his chair and moved to sit directly across from her with an aggressive familiarity that suggested he considered her fair game. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, Markham continued, his voice carrying the false jovial tone of a man who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. About your journey to Montana Territory. Dangerous country for a woman alone, especially one in your particular circumstances. Mrs. Kowalski emerged from the kitchen carrying plates of eggs and biscuits, and Cordelia May noticed that the boarding house proprietor's expression had changed from the previous evening. Where there had been grudging sympathy, there was now a cold calculation that suggested someone had been asking questions and offering money for information. Mr. Markham here has been most concerned about your welfare, Mrs. Kowalski said with false sweetness as she set a plate in front of Cordelia May. He's been asking about your plans, wondering if perhaps you might benefit from traveling companionship. The way she said companionship made Cordelia May's blood run cold. She realized with growing horror that Markham had been more than just casually cruel the previous evening. He'd been evaluating her as potential prey, and Mrs. Kowalski had apparently been recruited as an accomplice. That's very kind, Cordelia May managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt, but I prefer to travel alone. Markham's smile widened, revealing teeth that were yellow and predatory. Now, Miss Sinclair. A woman in your condition can't afford to be too particular about offers of assistance. The frontier territories can be quite unforgiving to those who lack proper protection. The threat was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Cordelia May understood that Markham was not offering protection. He was offering to become the very danger. she needed protection from, while presenting himself as her only alternative to complete vulnerability. "I'm quite capable of managing my own affairs," Cordelia May replied, though she could hear the uncertainty in her own voice. "Are you indeed?" Markham leaned back in his chair, making a show of examining her appearance. "Because from where I sit, you look like a woman whose ... Options have become somewhat limited. Damaged goods, as it were, learning to adjust expectations accordingly." The crude reference to her disfigurement sent a spike of rage through Cordelia May, but before she could respond, the boarding house door opened with a bang that silenced every conversation in the room. The figure who entered was unlike anyone Cordelia May had ever seen, and the effect of his presence on the other travelers was immediate and profound. He stood nearly 6.5 feet tall, with the lean, powerful build of a man who had spent his life in physical challenges that would break lesser mortals. His skin was the deep bronze of the High Plains tribes, weathered by sun and wind into the texture of well-worked leather. His black hair hung in 2 long braids decorated with strips of leather, small bones, and eagle feathers that spoke of achievements in battle and wisdom earned through suffering. He wore a mixture of traditional native dress and frontier practicality fringed buckskin pants that had been worked to suppleness through years of wear, a cotton shirt that was clean but patched, and a long coat of military origin that suggested he had taken it from a fallen enemy. Around his neck hung a choker of carved bone and turquoise that marked him as a man of significance among his people, but it was his face that commanded attention and respect in equal measure. The right side was classically handsome in the way of his people, with high cheekbones and strong features that spoke of noble ancestry stretching back through generations of warriors and chiefs. The left side told a different story entirely. A massive scar ran from his temple to his jaw, and where his left eye should have been was only an empty socket, surrounded by twisted flesh that spoke of violence survived and battles won at terrible cost. The silence in the dining room was absolute. Several of the rougher travelers actually pushed back from their tables, hands moving instinctively toward weapons that weren't there. Markham's predatory smile disappeared entirely, replaced by the wary expression of a predator who had suddenly realized he was no longer at the top of the food chain. The one-eyed man surveyed the room with the calm confidence of someone who had faced down cavalry charges and lived to tell about it. His single dark eye moved from face to face, cataloging each person with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to distinguishing between enemies and mere annoyances in situations where such distinctions could mean the difference between life and death. When his gaze reached Cordelia May, something extraordinary happened. Instead of the casual dismissal or morbid curiosity she had grown accustomed to receiving, the warrior's expression shifted to something that looked almost like recognition. Not recognition of her identity, but recognition of something deeper, a kinship that transcended the obvious differences in their backgrounds and circumstances. He moved toward her table with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to move silently through hostile territory, and every eye in the room followed him. The floorboards, which had creaked under the weight of other travelers, seemed to make no sound beneath his moccasined feet. When he stopped beside Cordelia May's chair, the silence became so complete that the sound of her breathing seemed unnaturally loud. "May I sit?" he asked in English that was precise and unaccented, the words carrying the formal cadence of someone who had learned language through study rather than casual conversation. Cordelia May nodded, unable to trust her voice. She had never been this close to a Native American, and certainly never expected to have one voluntarily seek her company. The other travelers were watching with a mixture of fascination and horror, clearly expecting some sort of violent confrontation. Warrior settled into the chair across from her with economical movements that suggested he was constantly aware of his surroundings and ready to respond to threats from any direction. Up close, Cordelia May could see that his remaining eye was the deep brown of rich earth, and when he looked at her directly, She felt an unexpected sense of being truly seen for the first time since her accident. "My name is Iron Hawk," he said, quietly, his voice carrying the weight of formal introduction. "I am of the Arikara people, son of Chief Running Bear, brother to warriors who have fallen in defense of our homeland." The introduction was clearly significant in ways that Cordelia May didn't fully understand, but she recognized the dignity with which it was offered. "I am Cordelia May Sinclair," she replied, grateful that her voice didn't shake. Iron Hawk nodded, as if her name confirmed something he had already suspected. "You are traveling north to Montana Territory." It was a statement rather than a question, and Cordelia May wondered how he could know her destination. "Yes, I have accepted a position as a schoolteacher in Cedar Ridge." "A noble profession," Iron Hawk said with genuine respect. "The education of children is sacred work among my people. Teachers are honored as the keepers of wisdom and the builders of tomorrow." The simple dignity of his response stood in stark contrast to the sneering comments she had endured from other travelers, who saw her employment as evidence of her fall from grace. Iron Hawk spoke of teaching as if it were a calling to be proud of, rather than a desperate resort for unmarriageable women. "The train will arrive soon," Iron Hawk continued, his voice still quiet but somehow carrying to every corner of the room. "But first, there is something you should know about the men who have been watching you." Cordelia May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Watching me?" Iron Hawk's single eye moved briefly toward Markham, who was still frozen in his chair with the expression of a man who had suddenly found himself in a cage with a predator. "The fat one with the yellow teeth has been asking questions about you since yesterday evening. Where you come from, where you are going, whether you travel with protection. He has been making inquiries about which train you plan to take and whether you have reserved passage in a private compartment." The implication hit Cordelia May like a physical blow. She had been so focused on enduring the social humiliation of her situation that she had failed to consider the very real physical dangers that a woman traveling alone might face in frontier territory. "I don't understand," she said weakly though. Part of her understood all too well. Iron Hawk's expression hardened, and for a moment, Cordelia May caught a glimpse of the warrior who had earned his battle scars in combat with seasoned enemies. "He believes that a woman with your circumstances would be grateful for any male attention, regardless of the terms offered. He has spoken of following you north, of providing unwanted companionship during your travels." Cordelia May felt her stomach turn as the full reality of her situation became clear. The crude comments about damaged goods suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. Markham wasn't just being casually cruel, he was evaluating her as potential prey, a woman so desperate and friendless that she could be intimidated into accepting his unwanted advances. "He has also spoken with Mrs. Kowalski about your financial circumstances," Iron Hawk continued relentlessly. "He believes that a woman traveling alone to seek employment must have limited resources and therefore limited options when faced with difficulties during her journey." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Mrs. Kowalski's change in attitude, the way Markham had positioned himself at her table, the pointed references to her need for protection, it was all part of a calculated plan to make her vulnerable to exploitation. "What am I supposed to do?" Cordelia May whispered, the reality of her helplessness washing over her with devastating clarity. Iron Hawk reached into his coat and produced a small leather pouch decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of hours of careful craftsmanship. From this pouch, he extracted something that gleamed in the morning light, a silver locket, intricately engraved with symbols that Cordelia May didn't recognize, but which seemed to hold deep significance for Iron Hawk. "My sister Morning Star," he said simply, opening the locket to reveal a small photograph of a young native woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. "She was taken by soldiers 3 months ago, along with my younger brother, Swift Arrow. I have been following their trail across 3 territories." Cordelia May looked at the photograph and felt her heart constrict with sympathetic pain. The woman in the picture couldn't have been more than 20, and her expression held the same quiet dignity that Cordelia May was beginning to recognize in Iron Hawk himself. They are being held at Fort Yellowstone with other prisoners from our village, Iron Hawk continued, his voice carrying the controlled emotion of someone who had learned to function despite overwhelming grief. The soldiers claim they are being educated in the ways of civilized society, but we know better. They are being broken, taught to be ashamed of who they are and where they come from. I'm sorry, Cordelia May said softly, recognizing the inadequacy of the words but meaning them sincerely. Iron Hawk closed the locket and returned it to his pouch. The trail leads north to Fort Yellowstone. I had planned to travel on today's train regardless of your presence. But now I find that our paths align, and perhaps we can be of mutual assistance to each other. I don't have money to pay for protection, Cordelia May said quietly, ashamed of her circumstances, but unwilling to accept charity under false pretenses. Iron Hawk's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, an expression that transformed his scarred features and revealed the man he might have been before violence marked him. I am not offering to sell you protection. I am offering partnership. You travel north, I travel north. You wish to avoid unwanted attention. I prefer to avoid the suspicion that traveling alone brings to my people in territories where we are seen as threats to be eliminated. The logic was undeniable, but Cordelia May hesitated. Traveling with a Native American man would certainly solve the problem of harassment from men like Markham, but it would also mark her as someone who associated with savages in the eyes of respectable society. Not that respectable society had shown much inclination to accept her anyway. As if reading her thoughts, Iron Hawk spoke again, his voice gentle but direct. You are concerned about what others will think. But tell me, what have others thought of you since your accident? Have their opinions brought you comfort or happiness? Has their approval protected you from men like this one? He gestured almost imperceptibly toward Markham, who was still watching their conversation with undisguised malevolence. The question struck home with painful accuracy. Cordelia May had spent months worrying about social approval from people who had already decided she was no longer worthy of their acceptance. The traveling salesman's lewd interest and Mrs. Abernathy's cold disapproval were hardly improvements over Iron Hawk's respectful offer of mutual assistance. Why would you help me? She asked finally. Iron Hawk was quiet for a long moment, his single eye studying her face with an intensity that should have made her uncomfortable, but somehow didn't. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Because when I look at you, I do not see what they see, he said simply. They see damage, something broken that offends their idea of how the world should appear. I see someone who has survived fire and bears the marks of that survival with dignity. Cordelia May felt tears prick her eyes beneath her veil. It was the first time since her accident that anyone had spoken of her scars as something other than a tragedy or a source of shame. In my culture, Iron Hawk continued, scars are stories. They tell of battles fought, challenges overcome, strength tested and proven. Your scars tell the story of someone who ran into fire to save others, who chose courage over safety. That is not damage, that is honor. The words hit Cordelia May with the force of revelation. She had spent so many months thinking of her scars as proof of her ruined life that she had never considered they might represent something valuable instead. Before she could respond, the sound of an approaching train whistle echoed across the station, growing louder with each passing second. Iron Hawk stood smoothly, and Cordelia May noticed that his movement caused several of the other travelers to tense visibly, as if they expected him to suddenly become violent. The northbound arrives, he said, extending his hand to help her rise from her chair. Will you accept my offer of companionship for the journey? Cordelia May looked around the dining room at the faces that had tormented her since her arrival. Markham, with his predatory calculations, Mrs. Kowalski with her mercenary coldness, the rough workers with their casual cruelty. Then she looked at Iron Hawk, whose single eye held more genuine warmth and respect than she had received from her entire social circle since her accident. "Yes," she said quietly, placing her hand in his and feeling the calloused strength of fingers that had known honest work and honorable battle. "I would be honored by your companionship." Iron Hawk nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both satisfaction and approval. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave the boarding house, Cordelia May noticed that the atmosphere in the dining room had shifted dramatically. Markham was no longer looking at her with predatory interest. Iron Hawk's presence had clearly eliminated that particular threat entirely. Mrs. Kowalski was watching with calculation, no doubt wondering if she should demand additional payment for her silence about their traveling arrangement. But for the first time since her accident, Cordelia May found that she didn't care what they thought. Iron Hawk had given her something more valuable than social approval. He had given her a new way of understanding her own story, and the courage to write the next chapter on her own terms. The northbound train to Montana Territory wheezed into Bitter Creek Station like an iron beast gasping for breath, its coal-black engine belching steam that mixed with the morning mist to create an otherworldly fog across the platform. As the massive locomotive ground to a halt with the screech of metal brakes and the hiss of released pressure, Cordelia May felt her heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and terror that had nothing to do with mechanical transportation. Walking beside Iron Hawk toward the train, she was acutely aware of the stares they attracted from every direction. The other passengers waiting on the platform, mostly rough-looking men in work clothes, and a few families, dressed in the practical garments of frontier settlers, watched their approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. A Native American man and a veiled white woman traveling together was clearly a sight that challenged every social convention of 1882 frontier society. Iron Hawk seemed completely unbothered by the attention, moving with the same fluid confidence he had displayed in the boarding house. He carried Cordelia May's traveling bag alongside his own leather satchel, treating her luggage with the same careful respect he might have shown a sacred object. When they reached the train, he stepped aside to allow her to board first, a gesture of courtesy that seemed to shock several onlookers who obviously expected a savage to display crude manners. The train's interior was divided into several classes of accommodation, from the luxurious private compartments at the front to the hard wooden benches of the third-class cars at the rear. Cordelia May had purchased a second-class ticket, which entitled her to a cushioned seat in a car that was clean but spartanly furnished. As they made their way through the narrow aisle between facing bench seats, she noticed that other passengers were actively moving away from them, gathering their belongings and relocating to different sections of the car. An elderly man in a worn suit and clerical collar looked up as they passed, his eyes widening when he took in Iron Hawk's imposing presence. "Good heavens," he muttered to his traveling companion, a thin woman who might have been his wife or sister. "What is this world coming to when decent Christian folk must share accommodations with heathens and their companions?" The word companions was delivered with such distaste that its implications were unmistakable. Cordelia May felt her cheeks burning beneath her veil, but Iron Hawk's expression remained completely neutral, as if he hadn't heard the comment at all. They found seats near the middle of the car, with Iron Hawk positioning himself in the aisle seat where he could observe anyone approaching. As the train lurched into motion with a series of jolts that threw passengers against their seatbacks, Cordelia May realized that she was now committed to this journey with a man she had met less than 2 hours ago, a man whose culture, background, and very presence marked her as an outcast from the society she had been raised to navigate. For the first hour of their journey, They rode in relative silence, watching the Wyoming landscape roll past the window in an endless parade of sagebrush. Rolling hills and distant mountains that promised both beauty and danger. The rhythmic clacking of wheels on rails created a hypnotic soundtrack that seemed to encourage introspection, and Cordelia May found herself stealing glances at her traveling companion, trying to understand the man who had so dramatically altered. The course of her journey. Iron Hawk sat with the perfect stillness of someone accustomed to long periods of waiting and watching. His single eye moved constantly but unobtrusively, monitoring the other passengers, checking the windows for potential threats, and occasionally studying the landscape with the practiced gaze of someone who could read stories in the shape of distant hills and the flight patterns of birds. There was something deeply reassuring about his vigilance, but also something that reminded Cordelia May of how little she understood about the world she was entering. The first real test of their traveling arrangement came when the conductor made his way through the car checking tickets. He was a burly man with the officious manner of someone who enjoyed exercising what little authority his position provided. And when he reached their seats, his expression shifted from routine professionalism to obvious suspicion. "Tickets," he said curtly, extending his hand toward Cordelia May while pointedly ignoring Iron Hawk entirely. Cordelia May produced her ticket, which the conductor examined with unnecessary thoroughness before turning his attention to Iron Hawk. "And yours?" Iron Hawk reached into his coat with deliberate slowness, a movement that caused the conductor to tense visibly, and produced a ticket that was identical to Cordelia May's. The conductor studied it as if looking for evidence of forgery, holding it up to the light and examining the printing with suspicious intensity. "This ticket was purchased in Cheyenne," the conductor said finally. "You got papers to prove you're traveling legally through territorial jurisdiction." It was a demand that would never have been made of a white passenger, and Cordelia May felt a surge of indignation on Iron Hawk's behalf. But before she could speak, Iron Hawk reached into his coat again and produced a folded document that bore several official-looking seals and signatures. "Safe passage document issued by Territorial Governor Hoyt," Iron Hawk said calmly. "Valid for travel through Wyoming, Montana, and Dakota territories for purposes of family reunification." The conductor examined the document with obvious disappointment, clearly hoping to find some excuse to eject Iron Hawk from the train. The other passengers in their section were watching the interaction with intense interest, some clearly hoping for the excitement of seeing a Native American forcibly removed, others simply curious about the outcome. "Family reunification," the conductor repeated skeptically. "What family would that be?" "My sister and brother, taken by the army from our village 3 months ago," Iron Hawk replied with the same calm dignity. "I am traveling to Fort Yellowstone to negotiate for their release through proper legal channels." The formality of Iron Hawk's language and the official nature of his documentation clearly frustrated the conductor, who had obviously expected to deal with someone who could be easily intimidated or dismissed. After several more minutes of examination, he reluctantly returned the documents and moved on to the next passenger, but not before making his displeasure clear. "Keep any trouble to yourselves," he said with a meaningful look at both Iron Hawk and Cordelia May. "This is a respectable train carrying decent folk." After the conductor had passed, Cordelia May found herself burning with questions about her traveling companion. The safe passage document suggested that Iron Hawk's mission was more complex and official than she had initially understood, and his interactions with authority figures revealed a sophistication that challenged every stereotype she had absorbed about Native Americans. "You speak with officials regularly," she said quietly, making it a statement rather than a question. Iron Hawk nodded. "Since the capture of my family, I have learned to navigate the legal systems of your government. I have spoken with territorial governors, army officers, federal agents, and Bureau of Indian Affairs officials." I have learned that survival sometimes requires mastering the language and customs of those who hold power over your people's fate. That must be difficult, Cordelia May said, recognizing the inadequacy of the word even as she spoke it. It is necessary, Iron Hawk replied simply. My sister Morning Star was studying to become a teacher in our village school. She speaks English, French, and Spanish in addition to our native tongue. She was teaching our children to read and write in multiple languages, preparing them for a world where such skills would be essential for survival. The revelation that Iron Hawk's sister had been a teacher created an unexpected connection with Cordelia May's own journey. And now she's being held at Fort Yellowstone? Iron Hawk's expression darkened. The Army claims they are providing education to help Indians assimilate into civilized society. In reality, they are trying to destroy everything that makes us who we are. They cut the children's hair, forbid them to speak their native languages, and punish them for practicing any customs that remind them of their heritage. Cordelia May felt a chill that had nothing to do with the train's inadequate heating. How long have they been held? 3 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, Iron Hawk said with the precision of someone who had been counting every moment. Each day they remain in that place, more of who they truly are is stripped away. My brother Swift Arrow was only 14 when they took him. By the time I reach him, he may no longer remember the songs our grandfather taught him, or the stories that carry the wisdom of our people. The pain in Iron Hawk's voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable, and Cordelia May felt her heart ache with sympathy for his loss. She was beginning to understand that his mission was about more than simply retrieving captured family members. It was about saving their very identities from systematic destruction. How do you plan to secure their release? She asked. Iron Hawk was quiet for a long moment, his single eye fixed on the landscape rolling past their window. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of carefully considered strategy. The legal approach first. I have been working with a lawyer in Helena who specializes in territorial law. He believes that since my sister and brother were taken, without formal charges being filed, their detention may be illegal under federal statutes governing the treatment of native peoples. And if the legal approach fails, Iron Hawk's smile was grim, then I will employ other methods that may be less civilized but more effective. The implication was clear, and Cordelia May realized that she was traveling with a man who was prepared to risk everything including his own life to save his family. It was a level of devotion and courage that put her own struggles into sharp perspective. As the afternoon wore on and the train continued its journey north through increasingly wild territory, Cordelia May found herself drawn into conversations with Iron Hawk that revealed the depth of his intelligence and the breadth of his experience. He had traveled extensively throughout the Western Territories, spoke several languages fluently, and possessed an understanding of both native and white cultures that allowed him to navigate between worlds with remarkable skill. But it was his perspective on her own situation that proved most transformative. When Cordelia May mentioned her fears about starting over as a schoolteacher in a frontier town, Iron Hawk listened with the kind of complete attention that she hadn't experienced since before her accident. You fear that the children will be frightened by your appearance, he said, making it a statement rather than a question. Cordelia May nodded, grateful that he had spoken the worry aloud so she didn't have to. Children can be cruel about differences they don't understand. Children can also be wiser than adults about what truly matters, Iron Hawk replied. In my experience, young people judge others by their actions rather than their appearance. If you prove yourself to be kind, patient, and genuinely interested in their learning, they will see past whatever scars you carry. But their parents ... Their parents will judge you by the results you produce, Iron Hawk interrupted gently. If their children learn to read and write under your instruction, if they develop curiosity about the world beyond their immediate experience, if they grow into thoughtful and capable adults, then the parents will consider you successful, regardless of how you look. His confidence in her abilities was both reassuring and challenging. Cordelia May had spent so many months thinking of her teaching position as a desperate fallback option that she had never considered it might actually be work she could excel at and find meaningful. What if I'm not good at it? She asked quietly. Iron Hawk turned to look at her directly, his single eye holding her gaze with startling intensity. You risked your life to save others from fire. You endured months of recovery and social rejection without losing your essential dignity. You made the courageous decision to leave behind everything familiar and start a new life in unknown territory. These experiences have taught you lessons about strength, compassion, and perseverance that no normal teacher training could provide. The way he spoke about her experiences made them sound like qualifications rather than merely hardships to be overcome. For the first time since accepting the teaching position, Cordelia May began to think of it as an opportunity rather than a sentence. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion several rows ahead of them. A group of rough-looking men who had boarded at the last station were drinking heavily from bottles they had concealed in their luggage, and their voices were growing louder and more belligerent with each passing mile. One of them, a bearded giant in a filthy coat, was regaling his companions with crude jokes about women and minorities that were clearly intended to be overheard by other passengers. Heard tell there's a redskin on this train, the man was saying in a voice that carried throughout the car. Traveling with some scarred-up woman, they say. Makes you wonder what kind of degenerate arrangements folks are making these days. The comment was obviously directed at them, and Cordelia May felt her face burning with humiliation. But Iron Hawk's expression remained completely neutral, as if he hadn't heard anything at all. Maybe we should introduce ourselves, another of the men suggested with drunken belligerence. Show them what decent white folks think of their kind of traveling arrangement. As the men began to rise from their seats with obvious hostile intent, Cordelia May felt panic rising in her chest. But Iron Hawk placed a calming hand on her arm and spoke in a voice so quiet that only she could hear. Watch and learn, he said. Simply, sometimes the greatest strength lies in refusing to give others the reaction they seek. What happened next would teach Cordelia May lessons about dignity, courage, and the power of strategic nonviolence that would stay with her for the rest of her life. But it would also test the growing bond between them in ways that neither had anticipated, and force them both to confront the harsh realities of traveling together through a world that saw their partnership as a threat to everything it claimed to value. The confrontation that had been building throughout the afternoon came to a head just as the train began its climb into the Absaroka Mountains, where the tracks curved precariously around cliff faces that dropped away into pine-filled valleys thousands of feet below. The drunk men had been growing increasingly bold and hostile with each passing hour, emboldened by alcohol and the apparent passivity of their intended targets. The bearded giant who seemed to be their leader finally stood up from his seat, swaying slightly as the train rounded a sharp curve, and began making his way down the aisle toward where Cordelia May and Iron Hawk sat. His companions followed, creating a small mob of 5 men whose intentions were clearly hostile. Other passengers in the car watched with a mixture of fear and anticipation, some shrinking back in their seats while others leaned forward with the morbid curiosity of people hoping to witness violence. Well, well, the leader said as he stopped. In the aisle beside their seats, close enough that Cordelia May could smell the whiskey on his breath and see the cruel anticipation in his bloodshot eyes. If it ain't the beauty and the beast themselves, mind if we have a little conversation? Iron Hawk remained seated, his posture relaxed but his single eye alert and calculating. He had positioned himself so that he could rise quickly if necessary. But he gave no outward sign of being intimidated by the 5 men towering over him. The lady and I prefer to travel in peace, Iron Hawk said calmly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that comes from absolute confidence in one's abilities. That the bearded man laughed, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Lady, that's a charitable way to describe damaged goods traveling with a savage. Makes a man wonder what kind of arrangement you two have worked out." The crude implication made Cordelia May's stomach turn, but before she could respond, Iron Hawk spoke again, his voice still perfectly calm but somehow more dangerous. "I would suggest you return to your seats before you say something that requires a response." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and it had the effect of escalating rather than diffusing the situation. The bearded man's face flushed with anger, and his companions moved closer, forming a semicircle that blocked the aisle and trapped Iron Hawk and Cordelia May in their seats. "You threatening me, Redskin?" the leader snarled. "Because where I come from, your kind knows better than to speak up to white men." "Where I come from," Iron Hawk replied evenly, "men who threaten women and children are considered cowards regardless of the color of their skin." The insult hit its mark, and the bearded man's hand moved toward the knife that Cordelia May could now see hanging from his belt. But before he could draw the weapon, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The train hit a section of track that had been weakened by recent spring floods, and the entire car lurched violently to one side. Passengers were thrown from their seats, luggage tumbled from overhead racks, and the drunk men found themselves struggling to maintain their balance. In the chaos that followed, several things happened almost simultaneously that would be talked about for years by those who witnessed them. First, an elderly woman who had been sitting several rows ahead was thrown from her seat and struck her head against a window frame, opening a gash that immediately began bleeding profusely. Second, one of the drunk men was slammed against a seat back with enough force to break several ribs, leaving him gasping and groaning on the floor. Third, and most importantly, a young child who had been traveling with his parents was thrown toward one of the broken windows, where jagged glass threatened to cause serious injury. Without hesitation, Iron Hawk was out of his seat and moving with the fluid speed of a trained warrior. He caught the child before he could reach the broken window, pulling him to safety with one arm, while simultaneously steadying the injured elderly woman with the other. His actions were so swift and instinctive that it took several seconds for the other passengers to realize what had happened. Cordelia May, meanwhile, had immediately gone to the aid of the injured woman, pressing her handkerchief against the bleeding head wound and speaking in soothing tones that calmed the victims. Panic. The practical nursing skills she had learned during her own recovery proved invaluable in treating the injury and preventing further harm. The bearded leader of the drunk men found himself in the humiliating position of being helped to his feet by the very savage he had been threatening moments before. Iron Hawk extended his hand without comment or judgment, simply offering assistance to another human being in distress. The gesture was so unexpected and gracious that it left the would-be aggressor speechless and clearly ashamed of his earlier behavior. As the train crew worked to restore order and assess the damage from the derailment, the atmosphere in the car had been completely transformed. The passengers who had witnessed Iron Hawk's heroic actions and Cordelia May's compassionate response began to see them in an entirely different light. The elderly woman whose injury Cordelia May had treated took her hand and squeezed it gratefully, tears streaming down her face. "Bless you, dear," she whispered. "You have the hands of an angel." The child whom Iron Hawk had saved ran back to thank him, chattering excitedly about his adventure and showing no fear of the tall native man who had become his hero. The boy's parents, who had initially watched Iron Hawk with suspicion, now looked at him with profound gratitude and respect. Even the drunk men seemed chastened by the experience. Their injured companion was clearly in significant pain, and the leader who had been so belligerent earlier now found himself dependent on the very people he had been threatening. When Iron Hawk offered to help fashion a makeshift splint for the man's broken ribs, using materials from his own traveling pack, the offer was accepted with mumbled thanks and obvious embarrassment. The train's conductor, the same man who had earlier demanded to see Iron Hawk's papers, now approached them with a completely different attitude. He had witnessed the entire sequence of events and been forced to confront his own prejudices in the face of undeniable evidence of Iron Hawk's character. "I owe you an apology," the conductor said stiffly, clearly struggling with words that didn't come naturally to him. "And my gratitude, that was the right thing to do." Iron Hawk nodded acknowledgement of the apology without making the show of either accepting or rejecting it. The child was in danger. Anyone would have acted. "No," the conductor replied firmly. "Not anyone, not everyone." He paused, then added with obvious difficulty, "If there's anything you need for the rest of your journey, you let me know." As the train resumed its journey at reduced speed while the crew assessed the track damage, Cordelia May found herself reflecting on the profound change that had taken place in their car. What had begun as a journey marked by hostility and prejudice had been transformed by a moment of crisis that revealed people's true characters. But perhaps more importantly, she realized that she had also been transformed by the experience. When the emergency occurred, she hadn't thought about her scars or her social status or what others might think of her actions. She had simply responded with compassion and skill, drawing on reserves of strength and competence that she had forgotten she possessed. "That was remarkable," she said quietly to Iron Hawk as they settled back into their seats. "Which part?" he asked with what might have been a slight smile. "All of it. But especially the way you helped that man who had been threatening you." After everything he said, Iron Hawk was quiet for a moment, watching the mountain scenery roll past their window. "In my culture, we believe that a man's character is revealed not by how he treats those who can help him, but by how he treats those who have wronged him when they are vulnerable. And you believe he's learned something from this experience?" "I believe he's had the opportunity to learn something. Whether he chooses to do so is beyond my control." The wisdom of this perspective struck Cordelia May with unexpected force. She had spent so many months focusing on how others had wronged her, Nathaniel's abandonment, society's rejection, the cruel comments of strangers, that she had never considered she might have the power to influence how people saw her through her own actions rather than her appearance. As the afternoon progressed, and the train continued its climb through increasingly spectacular mountain terrain, other passengers began approaching them with a warmth that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The elderly woman whose injury Cordelia May had treated introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson and insisted on sharing her lunch with them, refusing to accept any polite deflections. "Nonsense," Mrs. Patterson declared firmly. "After what you've done, the least I can do is share my fried chicken and biscuits. Besides, I've been traveling alone for 3 days, and I'm desperate for decent conversation." The child whom Iron Hawk had rescued, a boy named Tommy whose family was moving to Montana to start a cattle ranch, had become completely fascinated with his rescuer and peppered him with questions about Native American culture, hunting techniques, and wilderness survival. Iron Hawk answered each question with patience and respect, treating the boy's curiosity as genuine interest rather than intrusive prying. "My grandfather told me Indians could track animals for days without losing the trail," Tommy said with wide-eyed wonder. "Is that really true?" "Your grandfather was a wise man," Iron Hawk replied seriously. "Tracking is one of the most important skills a hunter can possess, but it requires more than just following footprints. You must learn to read the entire story. The land tells you, broken twigs, disturbed earth, the way animals behave when predators are near." Tommy's parents, who had initially been nervous about their son's fascination with Iron Hawk, gradually relaxed as they listened to his thoughtful responses and recognized the educational value of the conversation. By evening, They were actively encouraging the interaction and asking questions of their own about life in the territories and the challenges facing native peoples. The transformation was so complete that when the train stopped at a small station to take on water and allow passengers to stretch their legs, Cordelia May and Iron Hawk found themselves surrounded by traveling companions, who now treated them with genuine respect and friendship. The drunk men, still nursing their injuries and their wounded pride, kept to themselves and avoided eye contact with anyone. But the most significant change was in Cordelia May herself. Standing on the platform in the crisp mountain air, surrounded by people who valued her for her actions rather than judging her for her appearance, she felt something she hadn't experienced since before the fire. A sense of belonging and purpose that had nothing to do with social status or physical beauty. "You look different," Iron Hawk observed as they prepared to reboard the train. "Different how?" "Stronger. More like the person you were meant to be." His words carried such conviction that Cordelia May found herself believing them. For the first time in months, when she caught her reflection in the train window, she didn't immediately focus on her scars. Instead, she saw a woman who had responded to crisis with competence and compassion. Someone who had earned respect through her actions rather than her appearance. As the train pulled away from the station and continued its journey through the deepening twilight, Cordelia May realized that something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. The fire had taken her beauty, but it had also revealed reserves of strength and character that might never have been tested in the sheltered life she had been living. More importantly, she was beginning to understand that Iron Hawk had been right about scars being stories. Her scars didn't just tell the story of a fire. They told the story of someone who had chosen to run toward danger to save others. Someone who had survived devastating loss and found the courage to start over. Someone who had discovered that true worth had nothing to do with surface appearances. As the last light faded from the mountain peaks and the train carried them deeper into the wilderness territories, Cordelia May felt a growing excitement about the future that awaited her in Cedar Ridge. She was no longer traveling as a damaged woman fleeing from the wreckage of her former life. She was traveling as someone who had discovered her own strength and was ready to use it in service of something larger than herself. The teaching position that had once seemed like a desperate last resort now felt like an opportunity to make a real difference in the lives of children who needed exactly the kind of strength, compassion, and resilience that her experiences had taught her. And beside her sat a man who had helped her understand that the most important journeys weren't about reaching destinations, but about discovering who you truly were along the way. Cedar Ridge, Montana Territory, appeared through the morning mist, like something from a frontier dream or nightmare, depending on one's perspective. The town consisted of perhaps 30 buildings scattered along a single main street, with the railroad depot serving as the unofficial center of what passed for civilization in this remote corner of the wilderness. Wooden sidewalks connected structures that ranged from hastily constructed shanties to more substantial buildings that suggested permanence and prosperity. Beyond the town limits, endless forests of pine and spruce stretched toward mountain peaks that pierced the sky like cathedral spires. As the train wheezed to its final stop, Cordelia May felt a mixture of anticipation and terror that had been building throughout the night. This remote settlement would be her new home, the place where she would either succeed in building a meaningful life or fail spectacularly in full view of a small but tight-knit community that would have no choice but to witness her struggles. Iron Hawk had been unusually quiet during the final hours of their journey, and Cordelia May understood that their partnership was approaching its natural conclusion. He would continue north to Fort Yellowstone in pursuit of his captured siblings, while she would remain in Cedar Ridge to begin her new career as a frontier schoolteacher. The thought of facing this challenge without his steady presence was more daunting than she had expected. "It seems we have reached the parting of our paths," Iron Hawk said as they gathered their belongings and prepared to disembark. "Yes," Cordelia May replied, surprised by how difficult she found it to speak those simple words. "I want to thank you for everything you've done. I don't think I would have survived this journey without your protection and wisdom." Iron Hawk's single eye studied her face with the same intensity she had come to recognize and treasure. "You would have survived. Perhaps not in the same way, but you would have found your strength eventually. I simply helped you discover it sooner." As they stepped down from the train onto the wooden platform of Cedar Ridge Depot, Cordelia May was immediately aware of being watched and evaluated by the small crowd that had gathered to observe the arrival of the morning train. The residents of frontier towns were always curious about newcomers, but she could see that her traveling companion was attracting particular attention, and not all of it friendly. A tall, stern-looking man in a black suit and clerical collar approached them with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge of situations. His eyes moved from Iron Hawk to Cordelia May with an expression that suggested he was drawing conclusions about their relationship that would not be favorable to either of them. "Miss Sinclair, I presume?" the man said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Eastern education. "I am Reverend Samuel Morrison, chairman of the school board. We have been expecting you." "Yes, I am Cordelia May Sinclair," she replied, lifting her veil slightly so that he could see her face clearly. She had decided during the night that she would not begin her new life by hiding from the reality of her appearance. Reverend Morrison's reaction was carefully controlled, but Cordelia May caught the slight widening of his eyes and the barely perceptible step backward that indicated shock at the extent of her scarring. To his credit, he recovered quickly and extended his hand in greeting, though she noticed he was careful not to look directly at the left side of her face. "Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Miss Sinclair. I trust your journey was uneventful?" The question was clearly loaded with significance as his gaze moved pointedly to Iron Hawk, who stood quietly beside her with his traveling pack slung over his shoulder. On the contrary, Cordelia May replied with a composure that surprised her. "It was quite eventful and educational. I was fortunate to travel with Mr. Iron Hawk, who proved to be both an excellent companion and a man of remarkable character." The formal introduction clearly caught Reverend Morrison off guard. He had obviously expected either a shameful explanation or defensive denials, not a proud acknowledgement of her association with a Native American man. "I see," he said carefully. "Well, perhaps we should discuss the particulars of your arrangement with Mr. Iron Hawk at a later time. For now, let me introduce you to some of the other members of our community." But before Reverend Morrison could steer Cordelia May away from Iron Hawk, they were interrupted by a commotion near the edge of the platform. A young woman in a simple blue dress was running toward them, calling out in obvious distress. Reverend Morrison, you must come quickly. Little Sarah Brennan has fallen into Miller's Creek and we can't find her." The Reverend's face went pale. "How long has she been missing?" "Nearly an hour. Her mother sent her to fetch water, and when she didn't return, we found her bucket by the creek bank. The current is running fast from the spring snowmelt. If she's been swept downstream. The woman's voice broke, and several other townspeople who had gathered around began talking at once, their voices rising in panic and confusion. Cordelia May could see that while everyone was deeply concerned, no one seemed to know what action to take. Iron Hawk stepped forward with the quiet authority that Cordelia May had come to recognize. "How old is the child?" "7, the young woman replied through her tears. "She's only 7 years old." "And how long since the snowmelt began in earnest?" 3 days, Reverend Morrison answered, clearly puzzled by the relevance of the question. Iron Hawk nodded grimly. The child would not have gone far in the main current, but the creek branches into several smaller channels about a mile downstream. If she managed to grab onto something, she would likely be trapped in one of the quieter pools where debris collects. "How could you possibly know that?" Reverend Morrison asked with obvious skepticism. Because I have tracked lost children through similar terrain before, Iron Hawk replied simply. May I suggest that we organize search parties to check each branch of the creek systematically rather than having everyone search randomly? The logic was undeniable, and within minutes Iron Hawk had organized the townspeople into efficient search teams, each assigned to a specific section of the creek and its tributaries. His knowledge of wilderness survival and water rescue techniques proved invaluable, and even the most prejudiced residents found themselves following his instructions without question when a child's life was at stake. Cordelia May joined the search effort, following Iron Hawk's team as they made their way along the treacherous banks of Miller's Creek. The water was indeed running fast and high, swollen with snowmelt that made the current dangerous even for experienced swimmers. After 20 minutes of careful searching, they heard a faint cry for help coming from a tangle of fallen trees about half a mile downstream. Little Sarah Brennan was trapped in a debris pool behind a massive fallen pine, clinging to a branch, with arms that were clearly exhausted from the effort. The water around her was deep and cold, fed by snowmelt that could cause hypothermia within minutes. Several men from the town had arrived at the same location, but none were willing to risk entering the dangerous water. We need rope, one of the men said. If we can get a line to her, ... There's no time, Iron Hawk interrupted, already removing his coat and boots. She's been in that water too long already. Her grip is failing. Without hesitation, Iron Hawk dove into the creek and began swimming toward the trapped child with powerful strokes that cut through the current. The water was clearly shockingly cold, but he showed no sign of being affected by the temperature as he navigated around submerged obstacles and fought against the treacherous current. Cordelia May watched with her heart in her throat as Iron Hawk reached Sarah and carefully maneuvered her onto his back before beginning the difficult swim back to shore. The current was stronger than it had appeared, and several times they were swept dangerously close to rocks and fallen trees that could have caused serious injury. When Iron Hawk finally reached the bank with the exhausted child, the assembled townspeople erupted in cheers and applause. Little Sarah was conscious but severely chilled, and Cordelia May immediately took charge of her care, wrapping the child in her own cloak and using techniques she had learned during her recovery to assess for signs of hypothermia and shock. She needs to be warmed gradually, Cordelia May instructed Sarah's sobbing mother. Hot baths can be dangerous when someone has been this cold. Warm blankets and hot tea would be better initially. Sarah's mother, a woman named Martha Brennan, looked at Cordelia May with tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered. Both of you. I don't know how we can ever repay you. The child is safe, Iron Hawk said simply, wringing water from his shirt. That is payment enough. As the crowd began to disperse and make their way back to town with the rescued child, Cordelia May noticed that the attitude of the townspeople toward both her and Iron Hawk had undergone a dramatic transformation. Where there had been suspicion and prejudice, there was now gratitude and respect. The same people who had been whispering about her scars and her association with a savage were now treating them both as heroes. Reverend Morrison approached them with an expression that was completely different from his earlier stern disapproval. Mr. Iron Hawk, he said formally, I owe you an apology for my initial assumptions, and a debt of gratitude for your actions today. The Brennan family has been members of our congregation for 10 years, and little Sarah is beloved by everyone in our community. Iron Hawk nodded acknowledgement but said nothing, allowing the Reverend to continue. I wonder if you might consider staying in Cedar Ridge for a few days as our guest. I'm sure the entire community would like to express their appreciation properly. That is generous, Iron Hawk replied, but I must continue north to Fort Yellowstone. My family has waited long enough for rescue. Reverend Morrison nodded with understanding. Of course, but please know that you will always be welcome in Cedar Ridge. Any friend of Miss Sinclair's is a friend of ours. The statement represented such a complete reversal from his earlier attitude that Cordelia May had to suppress a smile. But she was also deeply moved by the recognition that her association with Iron Hawk was now seen as something that reflected positively on her character rather than something that damaged her reputation. As Iron Hawk prepared to continue his journey north, he and Cordelia May found themselves alone on the platform for their final farewell. The moment had a significance that neither of them had anticipated when they first met at Bitter Creek Station. "You have taught me something important," Cordelia May said quietly. "About seeing myself through different eyes, about understanding that scars can be stories of honor rather than shame. And you have reminded me that courage comes in many forms," Iron Hawk replied. "Not just the courage to fight enemies, but the courage to start over, to trust again, to open your heart to possibilities that seem impossible." They stood in silence for a moment, both understanding that this parting marked the end of a journey that had been transformative for them both. When Iron Hawk finally extended his hand, Cordelia May took it without hesitation, feeling the callous strength of fingers that had pulled a child from deadly water just hours before. "If you ever have need of a friend," Iron Hawk said, "send word to the Arikara reservation near Fort Berthold. I will come." "And if your quest brings you back through Montana territory," Cordelia May replied, "you will always have a home in Cedar Ridge." As Iron Hawk walked away toward the northbound platform, Cordelia May felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected gift of his friendship. He had helped her understand that she was not defined by what the fire had taken from her, but by what she had chosen to do with what remained. 6 months later, Cordelia May stood in front of her one-room schoolhouse watching 23 children of various ages work intently on their lessons. The scarred left side of her face was fully visible, uncovered by any veil or hat, and not one of her students seemed to notice or care about her appearance. They knew her as Miss Sinclair, the teacher who had helped rescue Sarah Brennan and who told the most wonderful stories about courage, kindness, and the importance of seeing beyond surface appearances. The letter she had received that morning was tucked safely in her desk drawer, bearing news that Iron Hawk had successfully negotiated the release of his sister and brother from Fort Yellowstone. Morning Star and Swift Arrow were recovering their health and their heritage on the reservation, and Iron Hawk himself had been appointed as a liaison between his people and the territorial government, using his knowledge of both cultures to help bridge the divide between them. At the bottom of the letter, in Iron Hawk's careful handwriting, was a message that made Cordelia May smile every time she read it. "Your scars have become stories of honor, just as mine have. We carry them not as marks of what we have lost, but as proof of what we have survived and what we have chosen to build from the ashes." As the afternoon sun streamed through the schoolhouse windows, illuminating the eager faces of children who saw their teacher as someone to admire and emulate, Cordelia May understood that the fire that had once seemed to destroy her life had actually been the beginning of a much more meaningful existence. She had been a burned bride abandoned at a train station, but she had become something far more valuable, a woman who had learned that true beauty lies not in perfection, but in the courage to help others despite your own pain. The scars would always be there, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they were simply part of the story of a woman who had discovered that sometimes the most broken hearts are the ones capable of the greatest love, and that the most wounded souls often become the strongest teachers of how to heal.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.